Hey all, hope all is well. This is another video in the Road to Grandmaster series, and in this one I'm going to go over my round 3 game from the Chess Max Academy GM Invitational. Now, if you followed the round 2 video, you know that I had a very, very wild draw against Grandmaster Mark Paragua, and that really concluded a crazy first day in the event, where, I had 2 really long games and really was emotionally drained, and I was looking forward to kind of a fresh start from round 3, just given the turmoil of the first few rounds. Now, because it's a closed tournament, there's no easy buckets, no easy games, as I like to say. So essentially, I was going to continue to play either GMs or IMs, because the average rating in the field was somewhere in like the 2430, 2440 range. So pretty much every opponent is a very serious one. And in this game, I was paired down against the very, very young talent Abhimanyu Mishra. Now, Abhi, for short, I think that's what most people tend to call him, is extremely talented, and I want to say he's still 11 years old. I might be wrong. He might be 12, but he's 11 or 12 years old, and he during this tournament, he was actually already had 2 IM norms and was vying to become the youngest international master in history. So obviously a very, very talented player, and a really tough test for me, particularly with the black pieces. Now, I was hoping that some experience would prevail. It's amazing. I'm really 15 years older than this kid, and but chess really shows no boundaries, whether it's age, gender, what have you, and talent is talent, and this guy is super talented. So, without further ado, let me get into it. So Abhi opened with e4. He's typically an e4 player from what I saw. And I opted for the Carol Khan, which isn't a huge surprise. It's something I've employed quite a bit over this year. And after c6, White played the move d4, and I went d5. And I wasn't 100% sure which variation he played, but I expected him to go for the advanced variation with e5. And it actually turned out that he did play e5, so I got a position that I actually had looked at a little bit beforehand. Now, typically in the structure, I've essayed the move bishop f5, and that's, I think, probably the most popular line in the advanced variation. You just get the bishop outside of the pawn chain. White typically goes knight f3, then e6, and then black slowly prepares for the c5 break. But in this game, I wanted to kind of surprise my opponent a little bit, and that's why I actually elected to play the move c5. And c5 is actually a rare guest in my advanced Caro games. I can recall employing it earlier in 2019 against Andrew Hong, and in one of the Charlotte tournaments, I had like a really, really marathon, I think it was like 150 move draw, but I got a good position from it, and I like the structures that arise because they're fairly complicated and dynamic, and I think a lot of it goes into whether you understand them or not. And so I thought it would be a good choice to play a strategic line against the young talent. So anyways, after c5, White played d takes c5, which is the normal move, and I played the move e6. And this is actually typically what happens here is that Black actually willingly buries the light squared bishop on c8, but argues that now that the pawn structure is kind of tarnished here on that e5, d4, c3 type of chain, that Black actually has a very decent French because of the tension that's released. And so typically Black recovers that pawn, White has a little bit of space, and White tries to use that space to build up an initiative on the king side, but Black says that in the long term my structure is pretty good. So anyways, after e6, White played the move a3, and this is actually all the rage in this position these days. The idea actually isn't really to save the pawn, because Black winds up taking on the very next move, but the idea is actually to play b4 and actually kick the bishop away once I capture on c5. So I actually took on c5, and after bishop takes c5, knight f3 is played, and now typically White goes for b4, and that's essentially the gist of the line. So after knight f3, I went knight d7. I think this is a move I had employed before. I do recall playing this structure against Hong. I don't know if I played knight d7 or knight c6, but I can recall inviting b4 and then putting my bishop back on e7. And after knight d7, white actually played b4, and I actually played the move bishop e7. And so, very, very strange position if you look at it for a moment, because essentially you might say, how is black going to continue the development? Because this bishop on e7 is in the way of the knight coming to e7, which means that the only square the knight has available is h6. At the same time, the knight on d7 seems to be lacking some space. I mean, it can't go forward with e5 or c5. So what is the prospect of the knight on d7? What's the prospect of the knight on g8? Well, I had a very, very concrete idea in mind, and I'd seen it kind of vaguely in a game from early in 2019. I think it was, I want to say it was Murali Karthikeyan played this idea and that I'm about to play, and the position wasn't quite the same, but I thought, okay, maybe I can essay this idea. And the point was that after bishop b2 was played, which is always the move that white is playing, trying to, pretty much eye the king side and discourage any pawn breaks with f6, I actually decided to play f6 anyway. And essentially the point is I'm actually willingly, spoiling my pawn structure to get some activity and counterplay along the f-file and in the center. So the concept is that if my king is castled, then in some later juncture, I might be able to, take control of the f-file and get some counterplay with my rook on f8. And the other thing is that I put pressure on white's central grip. Obviously, if the pawn on e5 goes away, then white doesn't really have any coverage with pawns in the center, and that could be advantageous for black. Now, in the structure, too, white typically needs to be a little bit careful not to just get overrun in the center, because white played the move bishop d3, but you might say, well, what about e takes f6? Isn't that a natural move? This would actually be a mistake in my opinion, because it would just allow bishop takes f6, and all of a sudden the bishop on b2 that's unprotected is actually the weaker bishop on the diagonal, and something like bishop takes f6 and queen takes f6 I think could be fine for black, because the rook on a1 is hanging, and again black has pretty decent coverage in the center, and I think it's actually quite a playable position. One of the things I discovered, and I should point this out, is that in a lot of positions where this happens, white is actually going to play c4 and undermine the d5 pawn. But what I discovered is that even in scenarios where there's e takes f6, knight takes f6, and c takes d5 and e takes d5, and black is saddled with an isolated pawn on d5, it's a lot of times not the end of the world, because black has a lot of activity. So that pretty much was my concept, was that even if white does manage to spoil black's pawn structure, at least I have activity to compensate for, and so that's what I was angling for. So anyways, after f6, Abhi went bishop d3. This is a normal move, good move, keeping the tension in the center. And the point is, you really want black to take on e5, because if I took on e5, white can just play knight takes and establishes this really nice wedge on the dark squares, and the knight on b1 can come over to f3 and really cause some problems positionally to black's position, because you can see here I have 3 pawn islands, black has 2 pawn islands, but my pawns are not mobile at all. Like both e6 and d5 are quite immobile with the knight wedged on e5. If I push h6 or g6, I'm just weakening my kingside structure. And so really the only pawn move that might be viable is a5 to try and undermine the queenside structure. But besides that, it's not really, there's nothing really special about the pawn structure here if the pawns aren't mobile. So definitely something that you don't want to do. And for that reason, I tried to build up the pressure with the move knight h6. Now, the idea with knight h6, very unusual, but the idea is to actually put the knight on f7, or even sometimes g4. Excuse me. I got a little cough there. I'm going to drink some water for a second. All right. But essentially the idea with knight g4 or knight f7 is to put more pressure on e5 to actually compel white to take the pawn on f6. Because again, it's kind of a tug of war right now with the pawn tension, and pretty much it's who's going to blink first. So after knight h6, white played the move queen e2. This is another reasonable move. Again, reinforcing protection of the e5 pawn. And now I played the move castles. And so we could see that, I actually managed to castle first, which is nice. And I still have decent pressure on the center and might follow up with knight g4, knight f7. One important detail here that I think can't be underestimated is it looks like the e6 pawn is just hanging. But actually, if you play e takes f6, I'm not actually going to play knight takes f6 because all of a sudden white has this nice wedge with knight e5. The idea here is actually to play bishop takes f6. And remarkably, taking the pawn on e6, even with check, is not very good, because if you play queen takes e6, check, after king h8, there are two problems that white has to contend with. One is the bishop on b2 that's still unprotected, but also the rook on e8, the rook to f8, threatening rook e8, pinning the queen to the king. So essentially, the pawn on e6 is immune, because even here, after bishop takes f6, knight takes f6, all of a sudden, the queen on e6 is attacked, and I'm also threatening rook e8 check. And this is a position that I believe is just losing for white, because there's no good square that the queen can go to kind of save itself. I mean, you could play, I think, queen e3 perhaps, but queen e3, I just still have knight rook e8, which is just winning, because if you go knight e5, now I have knight g4, so I'm going to pick up the queen for 2 pieces. And if you go queen e2, that's probably the best move in the position, but even here, rook e8 is going to be very, very annoying. And after knight e5, white's not losing the queen in this position, but I don't believe this position should trouble black too much. I don't think it's totally the end of the world. So, essentially, the e6 pawn is immune, or I believe it to be immune, because of this tactical detail. After knight h6, instead, white played the move c4. And this, again, is kind of typical in this structure, is that you try to undermine the d5 pawn, because if I do nothing, white would be very happy to play c takes d5, and after e takes d5, play e6. And that pawn on e6 would be a very, very annoying wedge pawn in the position. So now this is like a critical position where I have to decide what to actually do with the center. And unfortunately here, I went in the wrong direction. Now, I was all along thinking, okay, I'm going to challenge this this pawn on e5 somehow with knight f7 or knight g4. And unfortunately here, when I got to this position, I was a little bit excited, because I saw that white's king was still not castled, and I thought there might be some aggressive possibilities that I could entertain. And so I played the move knight g4, which was not my original intent. My original intention was to go to knight f7, and actually this would be the better move. But I played knight g4, and it was really based on a miscalculation. I'm going to show you what that miscalculation is. Actually, first, before the miscalculation, I'm going to show you what the better move is. The better move is knight f7, and the reason for this is now the e5 pawn is attacked too many times, and so if white just castles, black can actually take several times, and after the recaptures, black would actually have the bishop pair and material to boot, because after queen takes e5, there's actually bishop f6, eyeing that rook on a1. And so this type of position would be extremely undesirable for white, and is actually the way you want to attack the e5 pawn. Now, the key detail is that after knight f7, white can play c takes d5 instead. And here I could play knight takes e5, knight takes, and the point is that I'm getting a bishop pair for my, questionable pawn structures, because after bishop takes e5, f takes e5, it appears that after knight c3, white just has a really, really nice favorable position, because I have these weird isolated pawns, and white has this bishop that's lined up against h7. But black actually has pretty decent compensation, because after a5, very important move undermining the dark squares on the queen side, and b5, black can actually play e d5, knight d5, and bishop c5. And this bishop along the dark square diagonal, the g1 a7 diagonal, is actually really, really good piece, and gives black really full compensation for the structural deficit that might be because of the e5 pawn. And so this type of position, I think, would be totally fine for black. So basically, that was the key thing, was to go knight f7, and then after c takes d5, to go knight d takes e5 and kind of liquidate a little bit. And really the problem is this bishop on d3 is going to be lost, so that's why white gives up the other bishop, which really is not doing very much on the dark square diagonal now that black has played f6. So instead, though, I played the move knight g4, and I'm going to show you the tactics that I thought justified this move. So essentially what I was calculating was that if e takes f6, bishop takes f6, and castles, this is what I was looking at. I thought that I had bishop takes b2, queen takes b2, and rook takes f3. And I thought this position would net me at least a draw and maybe more, because I saw that after g takes f3, I at least have queen h4, which threatens mate and forces f takes g4, queen takes, and then this type of repetition. But I was also considering maybe after g takes f3, maybe I actually could play for more with a move like knight ge5 and actually try to play for some type of initiative. Now, it looks a little bit far-fetched now that I look at it, because I have a lot of pieces still at home, and so it seems unlikely that just with the queen and the knight I could really do too much damage. But I thought that I had at least a draw in my hands, and after g takes f3, I could think about, I could think if I had more in the position. But essentially what I had missed, and it's a huge, huge deal what I had missed, is that after e takes f6, bishop takes f6, which was played, I missed the move h3. And h3 is by far the best move in the position, and frankly, it just refutes my whole concept, because now I really have to deal with this knight on g4, and remarkably, bishop takes b2 doesn't actually do anything for me. In fact, it actually spells trouble. So really quickly, before getting into bishop takes b2, the reason why queen takes e6 still does not work is because the bishop on b2 is actually still hanging. So you can imagine if I go king h8 now with check, even though it was with check, the bishop on b2 is hanging, and after bishop takes f6, knight d takes f6, this version of the position, remember before where queen takes e6 check was played, is even better for black, because now the knight is actually already on g4 and covering the e5 square. So wherever the queen goes, black actually winds up picking it up with a winning position. And so even with knight g4, you still can't take on e6 with check. And so I thought that was a really good thing. And I thought the other problem is that, again, this bishop on b2 is a little bit vulnerable. And if I drag the queen away, I have those tactics. Now, what I had missed was that after h3, the move bishop takes b2 actually loses. And the reason it loses is because if you play bishop takes b2, white has the very, very simple but direct h takes g4. And all of a sudden here, my king is getting hammered on the h file and on the light squares. And I don't have any time to take the rook on a1. And this position is actually completely lost because the queen is also still hitting the bishop on b2. So let's say I grab a rook just to illustrate. After bishop takes a1, queen takes a6, check is actually now just checkmate in a few moves, because if I step to h8, rook takes h7 is mate right away, and so the only move is rook f7. And then really remarkably here, bishop takes h7 is just forced mate, because if I go king h8, then there's bishop g6, and that's a mate. But if I go king f8, also bishop g6, and there are two mate threats happening at once. There's rook h8 mate and queen takes f7 mate. And in fact, it's actually should be mate in 1, but it's actually mate in 2, because black can actually give a spite check on c3. But after knight takes e3, there's just nothing to avoid both mates. And I thought it's quite funny that I could play a move like rook takes f3, but still rook h8 mate does not change the story. So essentially, because of this h takes g4 move, white is actually totally winning if I go for bishop takes b2. And I realized that when I got to this position that I made this gross oversight, because now what it essentially means is that I'm kind of forced to put my knight back where it came from, and I lose a critical tempo. So after h3, I actually went knight h6 and admitted my mistake. but my gosh, it's a horrible, horrible thing to actually have to undo what you just did, particularly in a relatively sharp position where you like to think that every move really matters, because it does. And so the fact that I'm actually going knight h6 back suggests that white got a very, very critical tempo here. h3 is a very important move covering the g4 square in a lot of lines. And now you can see my center is extremely loose because I didn't manage to kind of simplify everything by getting that knight to e5. And so my bishop's still on c8, my knight is on d7, and I don't have the same coverage over the e5 square. And so because of this important detail, white's actually already almost winning. After knight h6, I just tried to regroup basically because, I made such a gross mistake that now I needed to play a little bit quicker and try to put the pressure on my opponent. So after knight h6, white played knight c3 now, which is a reasonable move now, adding pressure to the d5 pawn. And I now played the move knight f7. And again, it's a horrible, horrible feeling to have to, I could have played a knight f7 a few moves ago and not lost this tempo with knight g4 and the knight h6 back. But now I'm heading for the e5 square, trying to correct my mistake. Note that white played castles, but note that c takes d5, e takes d5 is not incredible because the rook on e8 becomes a factor and then comes to e2 with tempo. And then because white would need to castle now I could come to e5, protect the d5 pawn, and also attack the d3 bishop. So it's better to just keep the pressure on d5 instead of taking right away. And again, my pawn structure right now is extremely immobile, so it actually makes a lot of sense for white to just get all their pieces into the game and then force me to kind of defend the structure. So after knight f7, white did castle, and I played knight d e5. Again, this is a move I could have had quite a while ago with a knight not on c3 or a king not castled, but it is what it is. And after knight d5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5. I felt a little bit better about my position here because at least now I'm attacking one of Abhi's bishops. And I thought that if I could just get my bishop to a reasonable square, just get it out, get my rooks closer to being connected, maybe I could try to hold on. But I recognized here that the position was extremely precarious even still. So after knight takes e5, white played the move rook a d1. And this is actually really, really excellent judgment. One might say, well, why not play c takes d5 and resolve this pawn tension and then maybe play against the isolated pawn? Well, the thing is, if you do this, you actually open up the bishop on the long diagonal, and that's not completely desirable. So instead, it was much smarter to, again, just keep the tension and get another piece to the game, to the center, because I can't actually play knight takes c4 because my queen is actually getting hit on the D line. So after knight c4, bishop takes c4 is a huge problem. And if d takes c4, if d takes c4, bishop takes h7 just wins. So instead of those moves, I played the move knight takes d3, at least getting the bishop pair. And after rook takes d3, the pressure is still on because essentially my rooks still aren't connected. My bishop pair right now is not so hot because my bishop on c8 isn't very good. And there's a lot of pressure on d5. And one of the key features in the structure is that these dark squares are super weak in my position because of the nature of my pawn structure. So if black is somehow, if white is somehow able to trade the dark squared bishops, I'm going to basically have a strategically losing position because those dark squares are so weak. So I'm going to be pretty reluctant to trade my dark square bishops. After rook d3, I played the move queen e8, stepping out of the pin. It seemed like the only move to me. I was losing the pawn on d5 no matter what, so it was a question of under what circumstances to lose it. Note that if I played d4 trying to save the pawn, knight e4 is just horrendous. And while I might be able to play e5 and hold the pawn for a few moves, a position like knight takes f6, queen takes f6, and rook fe1 is just so terrible for black. It's like, for white, it's just a completely dreadful position because this bishop is going to be opened up on the dark squares. Actually, maybe rook e1's a mistake, but basically this position after e5, white is massively, massively better here because this knight is a perfect blockader of these pawns for now. And when white elects to do so, he can actually open up this diagonal. And so the move I was just showing, knight takes f6, is probably a little bit premature. White should probably start with f4. That looks better to me. And the point is now he's actually ready to play knight takes f6 because f takes e5 will follow, and then the bishop will be opened up on the long diagonal. And you might say, well, won't there be opposite-colored bishops? Isn't that a draw? Well, no, because essentially my king will be so weak, and typically in these structures, if there are heavy pieces on the board, usually the advantage goes to the one that has the initiative, and you could see here that that would be white. So something like ef4, knight takes f6, queen takes f6, and rook takes d4 would be nearly lost in my opinion. It's just too difficult to contend with the bishop on this diagonal. So instead I played queen e8, and my hope was that after losing a pawn on d5 that I might be able to trade queens. And a funny thing happened here, because after c takes d5, which makes a sense, trading that pawn, and after e takes d5, white actually played the move queen takes e8. And I thought this was a serious mistake. And it turned out to be correct, because essentially there's no reason to trade the queens. Trading the queens gives my king way more security than I deserve. My king was already quite weak on g8. I was lacking in development. And all of a sudden, when the queens come off the board, it's not as simple anymore. Instead, a much better move, which would have kept a very serious near-winning advantage, is just queen d2. And the point is, you're going to win the pawn on d5 no matter what. I mean, if I play a move like d4, it doesn't save it it doesn't completely save the pawn. It's just a temporary inconvenience, because now after knight d5, white will take the bishop on f6 and then win the pawn on d4 and have another wonderful opposite-colored bishop position, a pawn up with the lead in development. So there's absolutely no reason to trade the queens, because the pawns was going to be lost regardless. And really here, the best move I could play is bishop f5, trying to keep up with my development. But after rook e3, amazingly, this would be even better than taking the pawn, keeping the dark square control. Because if you play rook takes d5, I actually can play queen g6, and all of a sudden my rooks are connected, and I actually have a threat of bishop takes h3, and my bishops are kind of playing on both sides right now. But after rook e3, after queen d2, bishop f5, and rook e3, my queen has to move. And I really am obliged to play bishop takes c3, because if I move my queen somewhere, the d5 pawn is going to be hanging with check. And even in certain positions, if I play a move like queen f7, trying to not lose the pawn right away, because now it would appear that maybe you can't take on d5 with the queen because the bishop is hanging. In fact, white can actually play the move knight takes d5. And the detail here is that if bishop takes b2, there's the intermediate knight e7 check. And after king h8, queen takes b2 ensures that white, again, is a pawn up with a much safer king. And I believe white would be technically winning here. So really just a huge oversight to actually take my queen, because now after queen takes e8, rook takes e8, the worst is over. White did play rook takes d5 and is up a pawn, but I do have the bishop pair, and now I'm able to develop with tempo. So now I play the move bishop e6. White went back with rook d2, and really the problem for white here is it's actually quite difficult to untangle, because if you look at the previous position, the knight on c3 couldn't really move many squares because the bishop on b2 is hanging. So the rook really had to go to d2. And now after bishop c4, I'm playing another move with tempo, attacking the rook on f1, and really trying to get some compensation for my two bishops here in the open position by controlling certain squares. So essentially that was the dynamic at play. So essentially after bishop c4, white played rook b1, moving the rook over there. I didn't think that was so impressive, because essentially the rook is extremely passive on the b file. And again here, I almost have like Ruy Lopez Marshall compensation where I'm down a pawn but have the bishop pair. And white is still a little bit better, but it's not as serious as it once was. And after rook b1, I played the move rook a d8. And I thought it'd be really important to trade a pair of rooks here because essentially the dynamic is that if one pair of rooks are off the board, there's a better chance that I could actually infiltrate into white's position, and it kind of neutralizes some of white's attacking chances on the 7th rank. There are some positions where, because white has the better pawn structure, white might actually sacrifice an exchange to get rid of one of my bishop pair, and get rid of my dark square bishop. So there's some circumstances where if, let's say, the b rook is off the board in exchange for the g pawn and the bishop on f6, white would actually be extremely happy because then this other knight might be able to converge to e4 and get some pressure on the king. And really the huge difference is that my king on g8 would be very, very weak in such a circumstance. So after rook a d8, white took on d8. And I played bishop takes d8, which I thought was an extremely important move because white was actually ready to play a move like knight a4 or knight e4 and actually try and get rid of the bishop pair. And so by playing bishop takes d8, I ensured that I don't have to lose a tempo moving my bishop when the knight is uncovered. And I actually have a new square for my bishop potentially on b6, where it actually is a new target, which could be the f2 pawn. The other dynamic is that once the knight on c3 moves, I really want to infiltrate with rook e2. And so that's another important detail because, again, I would have had to waste a tempo if I kept my bishop on f6 after the knight on c3 moved away. So I thought this was pretty precise. After bishop takes d8, white played rook d1, now trying to centralize now that I don't have that pressure on the b2 bishop anymore. And I played the move bishop f6 back. And part of the justification for this is that now this pin actually becomes a factor again because the only way that white could try to relieve the pin would be knight a4, but actually that loses on the spot to bishop b3. And you could see here that there's a skewer on the pieces. So essentially, if white actually played rook b1 back, I would have played bishop d8 and repeated because, again, I'm a pawn down and, the two bishops are great, but, I don't really have more than compensation. But I thought bishop f6 was a pretty good move. So anyways, after bishop f6, white played the move rook c1. Now, maybe protecting this knight on c3, overprotecting it, and also potentially putting some pressure on the bishop on c4. And now I played the move b5, essentially cementing my bishop on c4 and really kind of neutralizing the pressure on the c-file now. So I was actually quite happy with this move because essentially I'm fixing the pawn on a3 as well. So now these pawns in an endgame might be targets. And I'm just kind of trying to restrict white's play. White now went rook d1 back. Again, trying to, I guess, potentially invade on the 7th rank. But I think the past few moves kind of demonstrated that Abhi was not really sure how to proceed in this position because he hadn't really made headway against the bishop pair. And this is honestly the best position I've had all game, given the circumstances right out of the opening. I really spoiled the position and was pretty much lost. And so to get this is just huge. And frankly, already here, because Abhi was kind of floundering the past few moves, I was thinking about whether I had chances to even play for more than just a draw. So after rook d1, I played the move h5, now trying to take some space on the king side, and essentially trying to nullify white's pawn majority on this flank, because essentially if I'm able to kind of fix these pawns on the king side, it might be difficult for white to utilize the majority. So h5 just gives my king another square for luft and also entertains playing h4 to fix the queen side. Or the king side. Now, I do want to be kind of careful about rushing to fix the king side because if I rush to play h4 and my pawn's fixed on a dark square, it might be quite difficult to defend if my own dark square bishop gets off the board. So I'm not going to rush with h4 unless white plays a move like f3. Then I might consider it, because then my one pawn would control all three pawns because the g2 pawn would be backward. After h5, white played bishop a1. Reasonable move. Now freeing up that knight to actually move, because for the longest time the bishop has been unprotected, so now it's actually protected. But if you actually look at the position, there's really no squares the knight can go to, so I thought even here I had pretty decent control. I now played the move a6, just overprotecting the b5 pawn, which now gave my bishop the liberty to kind of roam around. And now white played f3, which makes a lot of sense, essentially trying to give this knight on c3 an anchor in the center with knight e4. Given the kind of nature of the position right now, white hasn't been able to kind of get any traction in the center, and that's a big reason why he hasn't been able to make use of his pawn. But after f3, now knight e4 is a very legitimate idea. To deal with this, I now played the move bishop b3. Asking the question to the rook, because if the rook now leaves the first rank, I have rook e1 check, picking up the bishop on a1. So white played rook b1. And now I went bishop d4 check, and I thought this was a huge intermediate move, because it actually prevents the king from coming closer to the center. Note that if you play a move like king f1, bishop c4 is nearly mating, and the king actually has no squares here, so white would just have to give up the knight, and then this position would just be lost. So, yeah, pretty amazing. But bishop d4 check is actually pretty decent move, and it actually forces the king to the corner, which is very important for me. White now went king h2, and I went bishop c2, attacking the rook on b1. White went rook c1. And now I went bishop e5 check. Again, just trying some intermediate moves, trying to get something before white gets this knight to e4, trying to play on the dark squares, trying to attack this king. And after bishop e5 check, white played king g1. I now played bishop g3, and this was kind of the moment of truth for me, because really I thought I might be able to just play for a draw with bishop d4. It appeared to me that Abhi was probably going to go king h2 and we'd be able to repeat. But I thought here that I was so active that maybe I could play for more even though I'm a pawn down. And I was just attracted to bishop g3 because now this king all of a sudden is stuck on the back rank, and rook takes c2 is not possible because of rook e1 mate. So all of a sudden it appears that I actually had my kind of dream scenario where white's not able to make use of the majority at all, and I'm actually taking control. So I got actually very optimistic here, even though I was actually quite low on time because I'd spent a lot of time just defending this terrible position. So it was kind of nice to even get to this point. After bishop g3, white went knight d5. And I think part of the idea here was to actually attack my rook from e8 in some way with knight c7, because this rook on c1 essentially is stuck on the back rank to essentially defend the rook e1 mate. So all of a sudden white has to be very careful and didn't have many choices, so the knight was a reasonable candidate. Note that if you play a move like knight e4, trying to, free yourself, I could just play bishop takes e4, fe, and rook takes, and this position is actually nearly winning, in my opinion, for black, because still white's king is just in the doghouse here. So anyways, after knight d5, I played the move bishop b3, attacking this knight on d5. And here Abhi kind of panicked a little bit, because he should have done something else, but instead he played the move rook c8. Instead, he probably should have just gone back with the knight, and then we probably would have had a repetition again with bishop with something like this. But after knight d5, bishop b3, he played rook c8 and tried to simplify the position. And the point is that after rook takes c8, there's knight e7 check, and king f7, and knight takes c8. And here, I'm a pawn down, but the situation has changed drastically. It doesn't appear that white's king can enter right now. So the king's, and also white's kingside pawn majority is not really very useful as well. So it does feel to me that black had some type of advantage with the two bishops, and it was a question of how to proceed. Now, unfortunately for me, I had like 10 minutes at this point, and you might say that's a lot of time, but the thing is, if you're trying to, push the envelope in a position where you're already a pawn down, you really have to be quite careful, because there are certain exchanges that would really, really mess up my position and result in me being losing. For instance, if I somehow managed to trade the dark squared bishops without getting anything for it, all of a sudden white would be nearly strategically winning because of the control of the dark squares. So this king could just waltz in to the center. If this knight somehow managed to get to f4, c5, or even e5, I would basically have no counterplay, and my pawns would just be targets. So I had to be very, very careful here, and I thought for a long time trying to figure out the right path forward. And unfortunately, I played the move that just does not do much of anything and can cause any problems to white. Unfortunately here, white is actually losing with best play. So I'm actually going to throw it to you guys. Black to play and actually win. It's a very, very difficult line, but even if you find the first move, it's pretty impressive. And I will give you one hint, and this was something that I was thinking about during the game, was that this knight on c8 looks kind of trapped right now. It doesn't have many squares. It's not super supported, and so a lot of it rests upon whether you can control this knight on c8. So with that hint, why don't you pause the video and try to figure out how to proceed from here. All right, so hopefully you got a chance to kind of figure out what to do in this position. The move I played was bishop e6, but that's not the right move. The move that actually wins is g6. And the point is that you actually just need to defend the g7 pawn before actually trying to walk the king over and pick off the knight. And what I failed to realize is that I was always worried about the knight getting to c6. This was always my concern, is that if the knight gets to c6, it re-enters the game and then I have some problems. But what I kind of forgot was that once the bishop gets to d5, the knight actually can't go anywhere from a7. And conversely, if the knight goes to b6, it actually doesn't have any squares after king e7 or bishop e6. So essentially, the point is that if knight a7 is played, I play bishop d5, control this knight, and it's actually just trapped. And there's really no way to liberate it. And so basically, after king f1, king e8, king e2, king d7, bishop d4, bishop c4 check, my king actually slowly just walks to the corner and collects the knight. And the line continues a little bit, but one of the key things is that once the king tries to come out, I actually have this bishop f1 move, which is hugely important, picking off these kingside pawns, because the g2 pawn is actually a weakness as long as the bishop is on g3. And so remarkably here, the knight on a7 would still be trapped, and now that I'm winning pawns on the queen side, or on the king side, white's completely lost. So yeah, I could have just protected the pawn g6 and essentially walked my king over. Now, a little bit more challenging is the move bishop d4, because with bishop d4, the knight can actually come to b6. But the point is, on b6, it doesn't really change the story. And so now I walk my king over. The knight does get to b6, but once my king is on d6, I'm going to go king c7, I'm going to go king c6, bishop c7, and ultimately pick off that knight on b6. And so you can go bishop e3, but after king c6, knight c8 is the only move. And then after king c7, you can't go knight e7, because here there's actually bishop f7. And even in this position, you can see the knight actually does not have any squares. And the bishop can go to c5, but it's kind of in vain, because after king d7, my next move will be bishop h4, and I'll pick off the knight on e7. So remarkably, the knight was actually just held up in enemy camp and could just be collected. And if the knight goes back to b6, now I go bishop e6, control the light squares again. and now just try to bring my bishop on g3 over. Now, a4 is a very, very important try because it seems like it's overprotecting the pawn, or overprotecting the knight on b6 with a5. But the point is that now I can play bishop d6. And the issue here is that with the a4 move, the b4 pawn is actually weakened and undefended. And white can't actually save the knight on b6 and save the b4 pawn. And so the funny thing is that if you play a5, now I go bishop takes b4, pick off the pawn on a5, and then the knight is trapped, and I still pick it off. And so white really would have to play bishop c5 here. But after bishop takes c5, d takes c5, now king c6 is actually winning. And again, this knight doesn't get out. If you play c takes b5, after a takes b5, I'm going to go king takes next. And the knight has no squares toward the middle of the board and would actually have to go to a8 from where it would be just picked off. So remarkably, this move g6, which introduces the idea of walking my king over, actually wins the game. And I was trying to find ways to trap the knight, but I just didn't find this quiet move, which is a key prophylactic move, because after my move bishop e6 and knight b6, I don't have time to walk my king over, and this knight is actually kind of free to roam. I played bishop f4, not seeing the idea still. And after bishop d4, the position is just equal. And quite frankly, I am still a pawn down, so I am in some danger of losing. And so I played the move bishop c1 and actually offered a draw, which Abhi actually accepted. The point is that after the move a4 is played, pawns on the queen side will probably be liquidated as well, and the bishop pair will be enough to compensate for the 2 versus 3 on the king side, but no more than that. So we actually agreed to a draw after a4. Tough game. I actually thought that I did have some decent chances after a really, really dreadful opening. I just made a gross oversight and a sharp position, and when that happens, normally you're supposed to lose. So I was fortunate not to lose, but it was also kind of frustrating to get to a position where I'm pretty much supposed to win, and then I don't. So it is what it is. All right, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Please like and or subscribe to the channel. And if you want to support the Road to Grandmaster journey, you could do so by making a donation through the PayPal link in the description below. Thanks again. Take care.